Welcome, everyone. This is Caroline Staten with Transition US. Thank you for joining us today for our teleseminar on effective groups with Nick Osborne. And while people enter the room here, I'll go over a few announcements, and I'll get into more specifics about this particular call in just a couple of moments. But wanted to let people know that, and we'll be mentioning this again, but that Nick Osborne is also doing some courses in the U.S. on effective groups. The first one is in Amherst, Massachusetts, and that's September 21st and 22nd, with a Train the Trainer course on September 23rd. Then in San Rafael, California, San Francisco Bay Area, on September 28th and 29th, with a Train the Trainer on the 30th. And Los Angeles for October 5th and 6th, with a Train the Trainer on the 7th. And we'll be going over that again. And without further ado, I am going to introduce Nick Osborne, our guest today. And Nick is a leading trainer from the UK with the Transition Network. And his workshop that he's giving us a snapshot of today is one of Nick's labors of love for the transition initiatives. And he has integrated 20 years of experience working with leadership models, social change projects, intentional communities, ecovillages, and conventional as well as cutting-edge organizations. So the course that he's delivering, a 2-day course, as I mentioned, really is to help community-based transition initiatives and other social change efforts develop stronger group skills. And so I think this is something, Nick is offering us something where we can really build our toolkits. So Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. And wanted to turn it over to you in just a moment to introduce yourself, to frame the Effective Groups course, and then we'll also dive into questions and answers. We're on the call today for approximately 75 minutes, and there'll be lots of times for Q&A towards the end. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I'm very pleased to be here. And this is only the second ever teleseminar that I've done. And I must say it does feel quite strange to be sitting here at home in Glastonbury in Somerset in the UK. It's about 6 o'clock in the evening. It's a nice, warm summer's evening. I'm looking out over some green fields with cows in the fields. And it feels strange to be sitting here on my own, talking on a phone, knowing that there are an unspecified number of people at the other end listening and doing who knows what while they're listening, and you're there as well, Carolyn. So hope you'll be a bit of company with me on this call. I'll start off by introducing myself and just saying a little bit about how it is that I've come to be here in this position, delivering this effective collaboration or this effective groups training. Because it helps make sense really of what the whole training is about. I spent many years in my early 20s as a social activist doing a lot of different types of social change work, doing mostly campaigning work, working for organisations like Amnesty International, the local Agenda 21, doing saving rainforests in South America, all kinds of campaigning work. And I put a lot of time and a lot of energy into it voluntarily. And I got burnt out doing that kind of work, thinking, God, I'm putting all this effort in, it's not making any difference. Really, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this if it's not making any difference? Why am I putting so much time and energy into it? And so I packed it all in. And me and a group of friends, we very idealistic at the time, and we decided to go off and show, rather than try and campaign to change society, go off and show how it's possible to live as human beings sustainably on this planet. So we went off and found some woods, some woodland in southwest Ireland, And we basically built a little settlement there. We got the permission of the landowner. He let us stay there in exchange for some work managing the woodland for him. And we did some work there, and it was very idealistic. It was a very passionate time, but we quite soon, because it was very intense. The group dynamics were very intense in what we were doing, and we weren't experienced in group work, and it very quickly blew up. And we didn't all completely fall out with each other, but there were quite a few fallings out, and the group dynamics got very difficult. So I kind of bounced out of there into doing a permaculture course, and then felt like that was giving me a lot of answers. Here was a great design system for sustainability. And then from there got into the idea of applying permaculture principles to human settlements, and got into ecovillages and how ecovillages get set up and work. So I went off on a 3-month research tour around North America and visited 14 different eco-village, intentional community and eco-town projects. This was all about 17 years ago, so sort of late 90s. I was doing all this. And then did an eco-village design course at the farm in Tennessee, and overall visited about 30 different eco-village and intentional community projects, really doing research, asking them how they set up, how they work, how they do their governance, run their meetings, make their decisions, how they design their settlements physically, legally, economically. Wrote it all up in a couple of papers for the Eco-Village Network and a chapter for a book, and then helped set up the Eco-Village Network in the UK, here in England, for a year, and then went back to Ireland to set up an eco-village a bit more properly, where we did it a bit more formally. So when we came together as a group, we all spent 5 days doing consensus decision-making training. We got getting trained by Diana Leaf-Christian. She came over and gave us training in formal consensus. We also did an eco-village design course there, and so put a lot more energy into getting set up properly. After about a year of doing that, the group disintegrated again, but not because of bad dynamics and not because the group fell apart. It was more just that other things came into play. One of the parents wanted to be somewhere where there were more children. Somebody else had to go off and look after their elderly family. And then the group just kind of evaporated really more than blew up. And I just got really curious then. I thought, well, what's all this about? Well, how is it this keeps happening? And I sort of came to the conclusion that one of the biggest barriers for human beings living sustainably on the planet is less about the practicalities of it and the physical technologies. It's more about the sort of social technologies and how people can live together and work together and make decisions together and cooperate and take action and resolve conflicts and do all those things together. And all those things come down to really how do we work in groups to achieve a common goal. And I thought, where's the expertise in our culture around those questions? And I thought a lot of it must be in management, because that's what a lot of management is about. So I went and did an MSc in Management Development and Social Responsibility at the University of Bristol from 1999 to 2003. And really from that, since that time, I've just spent a lot of time, I've devoted myself to learning lots of different tools and techniques and processes for this kind of social technology of how groups work. So in these last 10 years, I've been learning different tools, using different tools, delivering training, running projects, leading projects, learning, taking courses, and really got invited by TransitionTown.net 4 years ago to put together a course on this, because I was a transition trainer and they knew that I had experience in this field. And then this course that I'll be delivering in America next month, and I'm going to give a snapshot of today, this is really the synthesis and the pulling together of all of those experiences really over the last 20 years that I've been doing all of this. So is that okay as an introduction? Does that make sense? Carolyn,
that was invigorating, Nick. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Good, thank you. And you can hear me okay? Just making sure the sound's okay, that's all right? Yes? Yes,
good.
It is. Yeah, it sounds like you're many miles away, which you are, but the sound quality's good. And thank you so much again for joining us today.
Good, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Delivering this course is really, it's an ambition of mine to be doing this work, because when I was struggling with all the group dynamics in various projects, I thought, I could really do with some help with all of this, and there wasn't any help easily available. So to be delivering some of this and sharing some of it feels like a privilege to be doing it. So I'll start off and give a quick 5 minutes of just framing really the course and introducing the kind of territory, and then I'll be using this Prezi, which is what I use in the course, as a journey to go through the different areas of group life, and then I'll be spending 5 minutes or so on each of the different areas, just really looking at them, highlighting some of the key points, some of the key issues that we need to address in groups, and some of the key questions. In terms of questions, I'll happily take, as we go through, I'll happily take any brief questions of clarification that anybody has if something's not clear. If you do have a longer question for discussion, then please make a note of it, and there'll be a space at the end for questions and answers at the end, so we'll take longer questions then. So this Prezi, I'm hoping that people on the call can see this screen that I'm sharing, and this Prezi that's called Journey to Effective Collaboration. It has 4 segments to it, and this is taken from one particular model of group development, which is called Forming, Storming, Norming and Performing. And it says really that as a generic pattern, many groups tend to go through certain stages as they, like a life cycle, as they start and as they develop and as they mature. It's not always a completely linear process, but there tends to be general patterns. And so the first stage is called Forming, where people come together, they get to know each other. It's there on Fantasy Island because there are often a lot of fantasies involved in people's heads around what the group is there to do. And it's through coming together and starting to work together that some of the differences in what people bring into the group and what they think the group should be doing get uncovered. And as those differences between people get uncovered, then you tend to move into more of a storming phase, which is those differences and tensions, people rubbing up against each other, conflicts come up, and it's really through the sorting out of conflicts that certain group norms tend to get established. And then you move into a norming phase where things start to get clearer about what the purpose is, about how decisions get made, about how power works, about how conflicts get resolved. Those things tend to come as a stage of maturing and going through a storming process. And then you move into, once your norms do get clarified and shared and started to be practiced between people, then you move into being a high-performing group where the work can really get done and groups can really fly together. So this model of forming, storming, norming and performing, I use that as a frame for the course, and within it I look at particular areas of group life that is helpful to go into each of those different stages, which can basically, if you give those areas attention, and there's 8 areas on this course that we look at, if you give those areas attention at the optimum times, what it can do is it can accelerate a group's development and make things easier so that a group can become a high-performing group more quickly. So there are the 4 stages of group life, and there are 8 areas. The 2 in forming that I focus on are purpose and ground rules. In storming, there's communication and conflict. In norming, there's tasks and roles and looking at power, leadership and decision-making. And then in performing, there's looking at effective meetings and sustaining involvement. And I do a quick signpost to running projects as well. So that's one frame I give for the course, and what I'll be doing in the next hour is basically talking through each of these different 8 areas of group life that need attending to. Just as another way to frame the course, I want to talk about 3 different types of group and 3 different patterns that we see in groups, because these often get can be helpful in looking at these patterns and discerning what's going on in a group, having an understanding of what's happening with power, and then getting a sense of which tools or which approaches would help things in that group. So I'm going to give a quick frame around different types of group, and I've called this piece, how do we untangle the mess of group life? Because things can get quite messy, they can get quite tangled up. So looking at 3 types of group, and really one pattern that we're very familiar with is if we think about a stable environment where it's quite easy to predict and control what happens. It's a quite appropriate form of group structure. There is a hierarchical structure, and that's one that a lot of us are familiar with, and I call that a stable structure. But as the environment is becoming more complex and the values in society are changing and there's more desire for working in more collaborative and participatory ways, people are tending to work with more flat structures and explore how do we reject hierarchy, how can we be more collaborative and cooperative. And that's another pattern that I'm calling collaborative groups. And as the environment becomes not only more complex but also starts to change more rapidly and change more quickly than collaborative decisions can be made, there's a need for a collective ability for agility and dynamic steering, so that while we can work together sometimes and be really participatory, and at other times a group needs to make decisions quickly and gives it an organisational group agility. And then a different type of group pattern there, which has a fractal structure and distributed authority, is more appropriate. And I call that an agile organisation. If you put all of those three together, and many of us in our groups will experience parts of all of these three, one way that I understand what happens in a lot of social change and a lot of transition groups is to say there's a bit of a problem, which is if we go into these groups with these kinds of values around collaboration and participation and combine them with a habitual tendency to create hierarchical structures, because that's what we're familiar with doing, we don't really know how else to work in groups, and many of those structures are informal, they're invisible, they're unspoken, there are informal power differences that don't get recognised. And if we do all of that within a rapidly changing environment, that takes us into a bit of a messy situation. And that's a way that I see a lot of the difficulties that happen in groups are as a result of the combination of these particular three patterns at this particular time in human history. I'm not going to talk about the hammer and the nail. So I just wanted to give that as a bit of a frame there, and I might refer to that as we're talking through some of the different areas of group life. So I'm going to jump back to the Prezi, and we'll start going through these different areas that need to be attended to in group life. Just a quick pointer here. There's a reading list that I've put together for this course, which if you visit this link here, it takes you a PDF which has a short summary of each one of these books, and it's all done quite visually. And yeah, there's a lot of books here that have inspired this course, and that's there as a good reference for anybody who can see some of the roots in the thinking that have created this. So as I said, if we start off with looking at the forming stage, and I'm going to give a quick look at each of these different areas. At the forming stage, the two areas I've chosen to look at are ground rules and purpose. So looking at ground rules first, if I just take us to this picture, really, ground rules are really, in a lot of the social change and transition groups that I work with, ground rules are not very popular to be talking about. You know, there's often quite, as groups move towards being more participatory and collaborative, there's often quite a rejection of hierarchy and a rejection of the formality of the kind of rules that exist in more hierarchical organisations and in transition groups. You know, we come together, we're doing something we're passionate about, and we don't want the formality of having rules, and we don't want the formality of what do we do if the rules get broken and all those kind of things. But really the reality is that in any kind of group, in any kind of social situation, there are always some kinds of rules or other, and they may be visible and they may be written down, like these ones that are operated in Occupy Chicago. And you can see these are very practical, clear, tangible rules. Or the rules may be invisible. They may be actually just group norms, which are more like, you know, the unspoken agreements that exist about how things work around here, but that we don't really talk about. A lot of time we're not even really very aware of what those norms are. So an example of that might be how a group deals with conflict. And if a difficult situation arises and a bit of conflict arises in the group, then people can, if there's a shared desire, a shared discomfort to not face conflict and not deal with it head on, and a discomfort around the difficult feelings that come up with conflict, then people can very quickly, they shove it under the carpet, or they ignore it, or they push it away, or they avoid it, all those kinds of things. And that can quickly become a group norm that happens. When something difficult happens, everybody kind of does that. And it's not spoken, it's invisible, and it's never formally recognised, but it becomes a norm that operates in a group. And then when somebody else comes into the group, they learn that that's how things work in that group, and that's the culture that gets created. So I make a distinction in the course between the formal, visible ground rules that tend not to get attention in transition groups because of the formality, and the invisible group norms that get created just in terms of what happens when we work together. It's important for groups to work well, really, to make those norms explicit, so that it's not so much that they have to be written down, but it's important that they're explicit so that people can know what they are, so that there's less confusion. The confusion and the kind of fuzziness around these rules and things like this are often one of the reasons for things not working out well, because people have different ideas about how they think things should work, and then they have a conflict about that. And when you're in conflict, that's not a good time to try and sort out your rules and your ground rules. So I always say, in the forming stage of any group, it's really useful to spend some time intentionally sitting down and saying, how do we want to work together? How do we want things to work? So some of the key questions that can be asked around ground rules, and there's some useful questions here that you can just have discussions around this. Why don't most groups create ground rules? What are the invisible norms that exist in our group? What roles do they play? The invisible norms play, and what roles do ground rules play? Why are ground rules important? What happens in our group when ground rules are broken? And what's the invisible norm in your group about following rules? Because what often happens is, even when rules do get made, then people break them, and then breaking the rules doesn't get addressed, and then it becomes an invisible norm in the group that we don't follow our rules in our group. And that becomes the unspoken norm. And then, the rules aren't so meaningful. So those are some questions there around some ground rules. And there's not time to go into this now, but in the course I go into a bit more detail about different types of ground rules that create different types of depth, safety, trust, and developmental context in groups, where the most superficial is just the code of behavioural conduct that's guidelines for how people behave towards each other. There can be a self-made agreement where people ask, what do I need to feel safe in this group to work and do my best? And then people make up their own agreement. There's agreements for effective groups, which I talk about a bit later, that can actively build a more collaborative culture in a group. And then a more developmental, more depth, creating more of a kind of evolutionary context in a group, are principles of an evolutionary culture, which is taken from Craig Hamilton's work in the sort of integral spirituality world. You can feel free to browse through this Prezi and look at it in more depth at any time. You can move into any of these places and see examples and zoom into there, look at those, zoom into there, and look at these principles of an evolutionary culture. There. So there's a lot of information here that you can dip in and out of as you want to. That'll be useful. So that's a quick look at ground rules. Moving on, I think I'll move on now. So moving on to looking at purpose and a quick overview of purpose. And really, the point of looking at purpose is it's a bit like the glue that holds people together when they come to work in any kind of group really together, is having some sense of a shared purpose. And what often happens when a group first comes together, or people first join a group, we all come with our own ideas about what we want to be doing in that group, what we think the group should be doing, and what the purpose is. And it's very easy to assume that everybody else in the group has the same idea about the purpose that we do. And of course it's really clear that this is the purpose of the group. And often when if those issues aren't made explicit, and if they're not talked about, and if they're not explored, and if they're not explored in some way that can create some kind of shared purpose, then that's when some difficulties can start to arise, and that can very often move into more of a stormy phase and where there's a sort of filtering process, really, where people discover that actually there is this other purpose that exists in this group that I'm not aligned with, and I've put all this time and effort into it, and I shouldn't have come and been involved in the first place, or something like that. So it can be very useful at an early stage to be clear about purpose. And there's two key questions around purpose. One, is it clear? Is it clearly stated, clearly articulated, clearly communicated? And the other question is, to what extent is group purpose shared? Because, and how does it get defined is another really important question. And that links into the power structures in the group. Are there a couple of people in the group who really define it, or is there a very clear shared process that ensures it can be done collaboratively? How is it done? How is the purpose defined? So those are some of the questions around purpose. Here's one of my favourite quotes, which, for the purpose of people who haven't got the Prezi, I'll read it out. It says, "If you want to build a ship, don't herd people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea." By Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. So that's one of my favourite quotes around purpose. Don't need to say anything else about that. Here's an example from after I did the transition training back in 2007, I think it was. The first transition training. In Transition Glastonbury, we were quite fuzzy and unclear about what our group purpose was. And then I came back from the training and I presented to our transition group here. I said, look, here's how I understand the purpose of an initiating group. Here's the different areas of what it is. And it had a helpful role in clarifying what we were there to do. And then when we had meetings, we would have meetings under these separate headings. And if somebody had an agenda item that didn't fall under one of these headings, then that was an invitation to think, well, should that agenda item even be on the meeting agenda? Because is it part of our purpose? Or if it should be, then does our definition of our purpose need to be expanded? This definition of purpose needs to be a living thing that we refer to and constantly evolve and develop. So that was really helpful in clarifying what the purpose was. And there are lots of different ways that we talk about in the course of methods and processes of how group purpose can be clarified. And one way to articulate purpose is to break it down into these three categories of vision, mission, and strategy and objectives. And in the course we do an activity around these three different areas. And then here's an example of an activity that you can use with a group to create a shared purpose, create a shared vision and mission using those different categories and finding ways to, a process to discover which parts people share and which parts people don't share. And then here's my other favourite quote around purpose. Again, for the people who aren't seeing the Prezi, I'll just read it out. "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy." So on the course I talk about a summary of forming after that. And then we move back and start looking at the storming phase. So in storming, lots of different things happen, lots of tensions and personality clashes and differences in purpose and differences in how we do things. These things are all starting to come to the surface now. And how well the individuals in the group can hold and deal with the difficulties that happen, that come up from those differences, really determines how well a group can storm and how well it can mature. And some groups, if they don't deal with the storming, what happens in storming very well, people end up getting fed up, they end up leaving, and then a group will bounce back into a forming stage. New people will come, you move into storming, and then people will leave, and then they just endlessly bounce between forming and storming and don't often get very much further. So two of the critical issues that could be dealt with at a storming stage, one is communication, the quality of communication and the patterns of communication that happen, and another is conflict. So looking at communication, in this piece I look at two different models of communication. and I'm not going to go into them in depth here, but just to say there's a control model of communication which has a particular way of seeing the world and particular strategies of communicating when you see the world in that way, and that has particular consequences on group life. And then I contrast this with a more collaborative model of communication, where there are different ways of seeing the world, different strategies to communicate, and different consequences in group life as well. This is taken from a book called The Skilled Facilitator Fieldbook. This is a slight adaptation of what's in there. And we do exercises where we experience two different ways of communicating and the impact that that has on how people feel, on how much adrenaline gets pumped into their body from communicating in a particular way, and then, in a controlling way, and then we contrast that with a more collaborative model of communication and how different people feel and how much easier it is to hear other people if you use some of these different strategies. And then these strategies down the middle here of collaborative communication are then gone into it in more depth, where we treat these as agreements for effective collaboration. If each one of these 7 things, these 7 strategies here, if these basically become your ground rules in a group, and this is the work from the Skilled Facilitator Fieldbook, then these are the things that will be more likely to create a collaborative culture in your group and more likely to create the kind of atmosphere and ways of working together that will enable collaboration to naturally emerge and then move through storming into norming and performing. So that's communication. We spend quite a long time on that in the course. Looking at conflict, moving on. And this picture is supposed to represent the idea, conflict happens at lots of different levels in a group. People will bring in their own internal conflicts into a group, which they then play out in group dynamics. There will be external conflicts about ideas around purpose, about how decisions get made, about how power gets used. A lot of stuff will be based on history and families. A lot of it's based on cultural patterns and cultural ancestral history, and it's all very complex. So, a lot of it happens. So it's not only about forming. Conflict is a thing in itself as well that goes, beyond the forming and storming. We talk about different ways of helping groups manage conflict, and this is taking a model from the integral model from Ken Wilber, where he says you can look at conflict in 4 different dimensions of a person, and you can look at it in terms of their individual interior world. What are the beliefs, feelings, and values around conflict? You can look at it in terms of behaviours and skills, around some using particular tools and methods of working with conflict. You can look at it in terms of the culture, shared beliefs and feelings and norms around conflict. And then in terms of the exterior collective systems and structures, you can look at the sort of collective capacity and how there can be things like a conflict management process. And there's an example of that later on. So here's a worksheet for nonviolent communication that sometimes we use. And then here's an example of a conflict management policy or process that can get used in a group as well. And on the course, then we look at a summary of what happens at the storming stage, which is really saying, if we can hold the discomfort around some of these issues that surface, and if we can find a way to work through them, then that will enable our group to become more mature, more healthy, more well-formed, and then we're able to move on into norming and kind of settling into how we work together and building a culture. And the idea of what a lot of this course is about is because so much of what happens in group life is invisible and intangible and hard to work with and hard to talk about, a lot of the course is about finding ways to make the invisible more visible, finding ways to talk about the things that are hard to talk about, finding ways to bring them out from underneath the carpet, put them out in a shared space between us, and then find ways to address it, talk about those things. And then once we can do that, then we can then make choices and have a more intentional, conscious relationship with those things, with things like ground rules, purpose, how we communicate, how we deal with conflict. And when we can make more conscious, intentional choices about those things, we're more likely to be able to create healthy, well-formed, well-functioning groups than just default to our less conscious, habitual, emotional, cultural patterns around them, which, let's face it, in a lot of groups, families and cultures are not terribly healthy. Okay, let me just do a quick time check. 22. So, going to move on to, I think we've got about 15 minutes before I want to move into questions. So, I'll do these last things in the last 15 minutes. And looking at norming, this picture is a real picture from China, where they are experimenting with new patterns of settlement. These are living pods. These little pods here, people live in them, and I think they're mobile, so they can move up and down the river, they can move in different environments. And this is an example of how, when people change their patterns of living, a different culture will get created. Different sets of norms will get created by those physical things that get set up in the world will set up different cultural patterns and norms. And that's really what happens when we're creating a group. How the group systems and structures that we set up will also create a different culture and create different invisible norms. And the more conscious and intentional we can be about those, the more chance we have of making good choices to make them healthy. So a lot of the issues that happen in groups, and a lot of the time is spent on the course, is really spent looking at this issue around power. Where does power lie? What kind of pattern does power have in the group? If we think about those three types of groups I talked about earlier, the hierarchical structure, the collaborative group, and the agile organization, hierarchical structures tend to use a triangular pattern with power, where it's concentrated at the top. The people at the top of the triangle have the power, they make the decisions, they have the authority to do things, and the people below take orders from the people at the top. Whereas in more collaborative, flat structures, the pattern tends to be more of a flat circle, and the power in the group at least is supposed to be more shared. So the decision-making process is more shared, there's more input from more people, more voices are heard, more diverse perspectives get integrated in more collaborative decision-making processes. Those processes generally take longer than the people at the top of hierarchy making a decision, but the commitment that is fostered and generated through a more participatory collaborative process means that those decisions tend to get implemented more effectively because people have more buy-in, there's more of a sense of internal commitment to those decisions that have been made because people have been part of making those decisions. And that can take a long time. That can take more time than many groups have in a rapidly changing, complex, ambiguous, volatile, uncertain environment that many of us find ourselves in today. And there can be a need for more agile ways of making decisions, which is where authority and decision and power, rather than being shared in a whole group, can get distributed to different people in the group, and different people get delegated or distributed different areas of decision-making authority, and then they can make those decisions much more quickly themselves. And so there are methodologies like Holography, which is a method that I work with and I talk about on the course, which is a way of using that more distributed model of authority and power. So this is really a foundational piece of the whole course, looking at how power is used, because all of the different aspects of group life are affected by, whether power is being used hierarchically, collaboratively, in a flat structure, or in a distributed way. And we look at some of these questions around how control gets shifted, and how there are different beliefs around power in each of those three patterns, and how there are different decision-making processes in each of those three patterns. So we look at that a bit. And I go through those. And then I talk about different tips of understanding power. We do experiential exercises around understanding power. And then talk about different types of power in a group, whether personal power or power by virtue of position. Then talk about different ways of making decisions. And you can see a decision-making spectrum here, where power is most concentrated when it's made by authority without discussion. And then it goes through to more consensual ways of making decisions, where power gets shared more in the group. So talk about that, and then You can put that on this chart here, which talks about these are the 7 different ways of making decisions here. And you can take that along an axis where the length of time gets longer as you go along the axis, and the quality of the decision also increases as you go along the axis. If you look at this, it might look like a bit of a formidable picture to start with, but if you look at the different ways of making decisions in turn, you can see that as you go from authority without discussion to consensus, that participation and commitment increases, and also time taken increases, and the quality of decision increases. This isn't an absolute model. There are obviously exceptions to it, but it tends to be a general pattern. And then we talk a bit about a formal consensus way of decision making and how some groups are very attracted to that way of working. So zooming back out, just for those of you who can't see the Prezi but who are following it, zooming back out onto the norming box. And I'm not going to talk about tasks and roles in a lot of detail. I'm just going to talk about tasks and roles in a kind of headline manner. Excuse me. And to say that tasks and roles, again, is one of those areas that in a lot of voluntary or social change projects, it's often a bit of a sort of taboo to try and define tasks and roles too clearly, because it brings with it that sense of formality of more formal organisations that a lot of people don't feel is appropriate for more social change groups. But there's a real need, I think, to get more clarity around, with a clear purpose, what are the tasks that fall out of that purpose. Once you know what the purpose is, you can define a strategy, an objective, you can define tasks, you can cluster those tasks into certain roles, and then you can allocate those roles to people. And then when you have clearly defined roles, then you're able to distribute authority into those roles and say these people have decision-making authority over these particular areas, and then they can make decisions, and then they don't have to be bringing everything back to the group. One of the things that very often trips up collaborative groups is the assumption that for a decision to be made, we have to take that decision to the group. So if there isn't a meeting for another 2 weeks and we want to do something, okay, let's put that on the agenda for the next meeting. And it holds everything up. It means the decision can't get made for another couple of weeks. It means it needs to be processed, and it is not really the most effective way of doing things. Whereas if authority is devolved to a particular team or a particular person, they'll make that decision, they report back to the group, and that's another way of doing it. So both of those things, clarifying power, decision-making, and leadership, clarifying tasks and roles, these become part of the kind of invisible infrastructure of the group, sometimes implicit and invisible in terms of beliefs about power, sometimes explicit and visible in terms of written down tasks and roles. But they become the things that, as a group comes out of a storming stage and out of the conflict, these are the areas that get clarified through the conflicts and through the tensions and through being able to work through those tensions. They get clarified to create these things. And then once these things are in place, then it's possible to perform well as a group. It's possible to have effective meetings as a group if you have clear purpose, if there are clear ground rules, if there's shared understanding around how you communicate together and how you work through conflict and who's doing what tasks and roles and where decision-making authority lies. It's very, very difficult to have effective meetings in one of these change groups, or even any kind of organisation really, to have effective meetings if those other things aren't in place. So I often see effective meetings in terms of performing as being a little bit like the icing on a cake, because it's only once all those other things are in place that meetings can be effective. And it's very often one of the reasons that meetings are so painful and so difficult and so laborious and so long, is that if those aren't in place, then those are constantly putting the brakes on being able to make decisions and get things done, because they're constantly being worked through and addressed. And you're having to kind of try and work through them each time, all the time. Whereas if you clarify them through a group development process, then it's much easier for the meetings to run well and effectively. Do I want to say anything else about effective meetings? these are the different areas that I look at on the course around effective meetings. The importance of, in more collaborative groups, preparing the agenda, deciding what goes on the agenda, what doesn't, having that clear beforehand. There is a method of preparing the agenda on the fly, which is done more in Holography, which is a very different way of working. The importance of recording decisions after decisions are made, so it's clear what the decision was. Allocating different roles in meetings, taking minutes, and then there are some signposts to some resources. One of the other areas that I just signpost to that I don't really talk about in the performing section is just running projects, and I signpost to a resource there that's called Dragon Dreaming, which is a really good, more kind of alternative, it's not very conventional mainstream, it's quite an alternative approach to running projects, and it's devised by an Australian called John, forget his second name, by a lovely Australian guy called John. And his methodology for running projects are saying, we start off dreaming. We start off in the dream time space, dreaming what kind of things we want to create from the project. Then we go into planning, then we go into doing, and then we go into celebrating. And this gives us a good map. And there are different parts, things that we do at different parts of the map that can help us run those projects really well. So that's a signpost to that. And then the last thing I talk about on the course is look at how do we sustain involvement. Once, we've been through, attended to those different areas of group life, once people are in the group and once those things are happening, we look at how can we structure things in such a way that will sustain people's involvement so that when new people come in, they feel welcome. They feel like this is a group that they're attracted to, that they want to be a part of, that they have an orientation so that they don't hold things up. When people join a group has to go through a new phase of forming again as the new person fits in. And really looking at ways that you can accelerate that process of people finding their place, finding their sense of emotional belonging and home, find where they fit so that they can quickly feel a happy, productive member of the group. And then we look at how to keep going. Once people are in the group and working together, how do we sustain involvement and keep going? And then we look at endings and learnings and how important it is to address the tricky issues of when somebody needs to be asked to leave. Without all those other pieces of group infrastructure that I've been talking about in the last 40 minutes, without those it's very difficult to ask people to leave if they're behaving in difficult ways. But if there are some clear ground rules that are set at the beginning, and then as somebody enters a group during their orientation, they get introduced into the ground rules, and they get invited to make an agreement of saying that as you join this group, you are agreeing to work within these ground rules or these group agreements we set with each other. If you choose not to, then you choose to make yourself not a member of this group if you choose to step outside of those agreements. So things like dealing with asking people to leave can be done much easier if these other pieces of group structure are in place. And then also looking at how do we learn from people leaving, when we need to ask people to leave or when somebody's leaving on really good terms. If we celebrate their involvement, how can we learn from what they can tell us about how we can do things better as well. So on the course there's some ideas around some good things to happen in terms of welcoming, sustaining and endings. What needs to happen, some good practice, and then we do an activity where we generate some more ideas about that as well. And that's a summary of what happens in performing. So we're getting towards the time for questions and answers. I just want to wrap up. What do I want to wrap up by saying? For the people on the call who are listening who are experienced facilitators already or experienced in group work, probably a lot of this won't be new to you. You'll probably know a lot of it, or if you don't explicitly know it, you'll probably recognize it in some way. I don't think that what I've done on this course is particularly rocket science. I don't think there's anything particularly dramatic or new in it. From my experience, what I found is, and really the reason that I've created this course, is it's in the synthesis in the integration of bringing these different pieces and putting these different pieces together in these ways that as a whole, looking at all these different pieces as a whole, as an integrated whole, and if we bring this integrated whole into our work in groups, it can help the groups develop in a more integrated way as integrated wholes. Because so much of the way that people work in groups in conventional organizations and in more cutting-edge social change projects, so much of it is fragmented. It's like we take this tool here and we think this tool is the answer, or we take this process and we use this process, and it's separate, it's fragmented, it's isolated, it's not working in an integrated way together. And in a sense, that's a replication of the fragmentation that exists inside each of us. And there's a way in which doing this group work in a more synthesized and whole way can also be a way of us bringing together different pieces in ourselves and in our relationships with each other. And this whole dimension of group work can really, kind of deepen and expand the whole project of social change, really. Because in doing that, we're also changing ourselves, we're also changing our relationships with each other, we're also changing the wider culture that we're a part of by transforming some of these patterns. So that's really how I'll end it for now, and back to you, Carolyn, to open up for some questions and answers. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. So for those who, of course, won't be able to be on the courses that I mentioned earlier, again, we've got the 2-day Effective Groups course in Amherst, Massachusetts on September 21st and 22nd. Train the Trainer on the 23rd there. In San Rafael, California, or San Francisco Bay Area, September 28th and 29th. And Train the Trainer on the 30th of September. And in Los Angeles, October 5th and 6th with the Train the Trainer on the 7th. So obviously, big country, not everyone will be able to join that. But I think with this overview that you've given, Nick, it's been really helpful. People can dive more deeply into the Prezi. They're all oriented to it. We will also want to have you back after the courses to do further work like this if you're available. And because there will be people trained in giving the course, and the people that will be trained are people that have skill in this area already. So we'll have some more trainers hopefully delivering the course in the area where our participants on the call are from. So thank you so much for that delicious taste and overview, and again, just orienting us all to the Prezi and the great work that's there. So I wanted to let people ask questions now or make comments, and how to do that is pressing 1 on your keypad. And first one's always an icebreaker, so hope some person will press 1 right away. And while we have Nick for a few more minutes, bring in a question or comment.
And can I just add, Carolyn, just while people are kind of collecting their thoughts to maybe make some comments and ask some questions, that on the Transition Network website, which is transitionnetwork.org, if you go to the training menu and go to the effective groups, there's a whole range of different resources under these effective groups things. And this effective collaboration course is one of a whole range of resources. And there's things like the reading list, there's an effective groups toolkit, there's some different animations and some videos talking through different aspects of group life. So there's quite a lot of other resources that we're making available to support people doing this work in their groups if they already have some facilitation skills, or if they don't, there are some instructions for how to do some of this work themselves as well. So we're really trying to build capacity in this as much as possible.
Great, thank you, Nick for that. And we'll be building our base too on the Transition US website with some resources linking to some of those that Nick has mentioned as well. So over to you, Tina. You've got your hand up. Tina Clark, go ahead.
Hey, Nick, we're so excited to have you coming to Amherst, and I just wanted to thank you for this wonderful overview, and just say that I'm really impressed that you already have such a facility with all of these concepts. It feels like you very nimbly apply them to case studies, and I just wondered if you had an example out of how you have done how you've applied some of these, or a personal experience that you wanted to mention, or something that you've seen, an example of how you've implemented.
Yeah. Are there many other hands? I'm just thinking how long to spend on this answer. Are there many other hands up?
At the moment, Nick, there are 3 hands up, and usually, something will stimulate another question from your comments. But at this point, 3 hands. Yeah.
3 hands. Okay.
Actually,
so I will be. Sorry,
go ahead and feel free to take another question, because I just realized that that's what you'll be answering in the course, is how to apply all of this.
Well,
specific examples.
And as well, some of the people on the call won't be at the course, so feel free, Nick, dive in, give us an example if you would.
So one example is here on the Prezi that I didn't cover in my talk, but I'll use it as it's a visual example. It's in the norming box, and it's in the tasks and roles. I tell a story of how in Transition Glastonbury, when we had a very active period, and then we had a very quiet dormant period, and we went into a bit of a lull. Didn't want to do that. When we reformed, this is a story of how we reformed and how we used the process around tasks and roles to create clarity around tasks and roles. So we had a period of burnout, and after working too hard, when we reformed, we created a SurveyMonkey questionnaire that was asking people about the different ways they might be involved and how they wanted to be involved. We sent that out to our mailing list, and we got a sense of what people wanted to be involved in. We then did a group process where we asked people a series of questions, and they put their answers on post-it notes on flip charts. And the questions we asked were things like, why do I want to be involved? What specific practical things do I want to achieve? What can I offer? And what will help me sustain my involvement? And then we worked through sticking the answers up on the flip charts. And then I collated all that material into these mind maps and kind of organized them. And from that, devised these 5 areas of work that became our strategic headings of work. And then under those strategic headings of work, then created different tasks and roles from all those things that people had said. And then so in terms of supporting interest groups, there was a task around Spark and foster new groups to get set up. And then a breakdown of what those tasks involved, and a breakdown of the skills and qualities and resources that were needed. And then we did an activity where we identified some of the team members and a lead person if there's any training needed. So all of that went together, and then did that there. And that went together and then in the course I give out this template that people can use to do that process. And this is a summary of how that process worked. But that's really an example of how you can use a process like this to start to clarify tasks and roles and who's doing what, really, into teams. So there's one example.
Thank you, Nick. That was very rich. And going to another question. Angelo, go ahead.
Hey, Nick. Thank you so much for your education and your inspiration and your motivation to keep going. So I had one question for you, or a couple, two-tiered question in terms of actual structure of the course that's coming up. Will we be working around some of these exercises, or is it going to be mostly based by lecture? And then also coupled with that is, what would you suggest some of us to start preparing and start thinking about before we actually enter this course that would help us out?
Yeah, good. Thank you. But 2 very good questions. In terms of the delivery of how the course works, it's a combination of some presentations for each of the different areas of group life. I do a short kind of introductory presentation with key points and some key sort of issues. And then there are practical, experiential activities around each one of these areas as well. And then a period of discussion and reflection. So it's really a mixture of presentation, activities, reflection, and then after each one of these areas of these eight areas of group life, I have an action and reflection log, and I ask people to note down any actions that need to be taken in their group for those areas and any reflections they have about their learning. So they end the course with a kind of a complete log of each of those different areas and actions and reflections. And the feedback that I've got when I've do evaluations on the course, because I always ask about the balance of, delivery of information and practical activities, and then the feedback I've got is that the balance is about right. Because obviously some people prefer more of one than the other, and you can never keep everybody happy all the time, but try to design it in that way. And in terms of preparation, I would suggest thinking, if you look at the Prezi and think about the different areas of group life, you can think, well, what are the areas that we're struggling with in our group? And maybe, reflect on that question yourself, ask other people in your group that same question, what are we struggling with? And then you can look at some of the questions or some of the material on the Prezi and use that to stimulate some discussion. There are 3 animated videos on the Transition Network website that I referred to earlier. They've been made for people to show in their groups, and then for that to be a stimulation for group discussion, because there are some quite provocative things in there that will hopefully evoke some responses from people and stimulate a kind of a foundation for group discussion. So there's some ideas around preparation.
Thank you.
Does that answer your questions, Angelo?
Yes, Nick, thank you. That summed it up very nicely.
Great, thanks.
And just wanted to invite people again, press 1 on your keypad with any questions or comments. Want to hear especially from those people that might not be able to take the course at this coming month. So we want to leave you with some answers to any questions you have. Want to turn to Marissa. And let's see, Marissa, I need to give you the mic. There you go. Almost. Actually, it's not letting me get. There's the mic. Go ahead.
Hi, Nick. Thank you.
Hey, Marissa.
You actually just kind of answered my question to some degree, but I'm thinking about how useful this course would be for one group that I'm working with in particular. But I know some of the folks in that group are either kind of averse or just don't see it as a priority. And so what I was wondering about is if you can suggest strategies for, bringing these concepts to a group that isn't totally bought in already. But I do think that the video would probably be a great way to stimulate conversation and interest. But if you have any other thoughts on that, and how effective is it if there's only a couple people who are really excited about exploring the group dynamic?
Yeah, thank you. It's such a good question, because that is the typical pattern that I've seen. Is if you're lucky, you'll get one or a few people in a group who are stoked about this kind of work, and a lot of the other people are not so interested. There's one particular activity that I do on the course, which I do suggest people use it in their groups, and it's I call it the action and reflection spectrum. And what I do is I clear the room and I say to people, imagine that there's a spectrum and there's a line going along the middle of this room, and at one end of the spectrum is the more action-orientated end. It's for the people who, they're the people who they like to get things done. They're impatient. The idea of going to a meeting where you talk about how you make decisions, they couldn't bear going to such a meeting because they just want to get on with it. They don't want to be spending time doing group process. They don't want to be spending time planning. They are, the activists. They just want to, get things done. They're quite driven. They're quite passionate. They're quite charismatic, and they, want to get things done. The opposite end of that spectrum is a more process-based, planning-based, reflective-based approach. And people who tend to go up this end of the spectrum, they tend to be the people who, they like to sit back, they like to reflect, they like to talk things through. They like to think things through and feel things through. They like to process them, talking about it with each other. And they like to have a sense that they really work things through before they want to take any action. They really like the group process and the collaboration that's involved in all of that. What I've painted there at the two ends of the spectrum are quite polarized opposites. And I say, if you imagine a spectrum with those two polar ends, and then there are all different places in between, I ask people to think about a particular group, and it might be, their transition group or one group that they're involved in, and think about, where they are personally in that group on that spectrum, and then to go and stand in the room where they feel they are. And you tend to get, some people at the action end, some people at the reflection end, some people kind of splattered across the middle, and then just have a conversation from that position and say, why have you placed yourself there? And generally you have to, there isn't always time to ask everybody, but it's really, it's using the space in the room to open up that conversation. And then, if you have all people focused up one end, which can happen sometimes in groups, you will get a kind of very uneven distribution. That's an indication of, the particular culture in that group, and it's an indication that, well, maybe that's why we never get anything done, because we haven't got any action-orientated people here, or maybe that's why, we're always doing things and there's never enough planning because we haven't got any reflectors in the group, or it's a chance for the people at the opposite ends to have a conversation with each other and air some of their frustrations or air some of their respect for what happens at each end. So that's one way, is to do that action and reflection spectrum in your group. There's another thing you can do, which when we get to the end of the course, people are very often, excited about this work and stoked about it, and then they say, yeah, but, I wish my whole group was here, and there's only two of us here, and how do we take this back to our group? So at the very bottom of the Prezi, there's a couple of pieces that are to do with summing up, and one of them is here, which is, this is the process for taking the learning back to your group. And I probably won't go through it in detail here, but I'll just say there's a suggestion here of, doing a review of what's working in your group, explaining how some things from the course can help, asking to introduce some key concepts, seeking to agree to spend regular time on group development, and making a rough plan for it, and then building in regular reviews. So there's a process there that you can use, and we go through some of this at the end of the course about how do we take some of this learning back with us. And one of the key concepts that I haven't talked about yet, and that it's quite useful to bring into groups that aren't very familiar with this territory, is just to say in groups there are two kinds of time. And there's the action time, where the task time, where you're just getting on and you're just doing it. And that's the type of time where most groups tend to spend most of their time. There's another kind of time which you can call it development time or reflective time, and it's like that's the time when you're not doing any of the action of the group. That's the time when you are stepping back, you're reflecting on the process of how you work together, you're reflecting on your purpose, you're reflecting on things, and you're looking at the infrastructure, you're looking at the invisible stuff, you're looking at how you work together. And it's useful to make a distinction between those two types of time, and then to build in this kind of looped, it's like a kind of spiral loop of, as you're moving forward, you do some action, then you come back into reflection, then you go back more into action, and you're constantly going through this action and reflection cycle as you're taking action. And it helps to build in learning and development of your group infrastructure over time. So there's a process you can use here for doing that as well. Does that answer your question, Marissa?
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Any other questions or reflections? And Tina, I think I might have inadvertently had your mic off. If you weren't complete in your thought, chime in again.
No, it's great. Nick, this is wonderful.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you. I think I probably made my final comments when I was summing up my presentation by, saying the kind of bigger piece of social change work that this work can touch into those bigger dimensions and the internal personal dimensions as well. But in terms of kind of practical summing up, I think really this territory of group dynamics and group life and how we work together is such a vast territory. You know, you could spend your whole life studying it and practicing it and, you know, working it, and still you'd only have really got a fraction of it. And that's certainly how I feel. So it is, you know, it's one of those fields that has become so big that it's impossible to really master, because it's so big and complex and wide and deep. And it can feel quite overwhelming, and I think there's a recognition there that, you know, this kind of work does take time. It's not, in this work there aren't any quick fixes or simple solutions or any kind of quick buttons you can press to give a particular effect or a particular solution. So there is an aspect of you know, recognizing that this work takes time. It is a process, evolving kind of work. And as well as that, there are tools and structures and processes and techniques that you can, you know, pick something up quite simply and apply it. You know, you can work with those 7 different ways of making decisions in a group. You can do an activity around that, the instructions for the activity, in the effective groups toolkit. You can do that with your group even if you're not a terribly experienced facilitator. You can do that, and that can have quite a profound effect on your group, just by the thing of doing an activity. And what you're doing is you're giving people a language to talk about something that's normally too close to us to be able to give voice to, and it's too invisible and it's too intangible. But by doing an activity and giving a language and saying, oh, this is one of those types of decisions that can be made by a committee, or it can be devolved to that group, or should be made by that person, or we need to make it by consensus. Just giving people that language then can transform things in a group, and so you can do these isolated things that will ripple out and have wider, you know, unforeseen impacts in a group as well. So really my encouragement and reassurance is if you do feel daunted by the scale of this work, which I often do, you know, you can just treat it like an elephant, how you eat an elephant. You know, you chop it up into small pieces and eat it one piece at a time, unless you're vegetarian. But yeah, you know, you can chop it up in small pieces and do it one piece at a time, even though it is part of this more integrated whole that I was talking about as well. You can take both approaches. I think that's how I'll finish.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick. And for those of you, again, interested in pursuing this, getting more skilled, look on our website at transitionus.org. For the upcoming courses, we are offering scholarships as well. We definitely want this work to ripple out throughout the transition work and social change work in the United States. So please let people know about it as well. And Nick, I want to thank you so much. I'm so looking forward to you being in the U.S. and touching so many people with your skills from all of these years of work. And I just know that you'll make a very great impact. And you have already on this call today. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and look forward to seeing you in a month's time.
Thank you, and thank you very much for, you know, the opportunity, the invitation to come and do this. I feel very privileged and very honoured to be doing it, and, you know, I know it's taken a lot of work and effort on your part to create this opportunity and to make it happen. So, you know, big thank you to you, Anne-Marie.